The patrol truck idled beside a dry wash as frost clung to creosote, a flashlight catching shoe prints that ended abruptly. The desert silent, the air metallic, evidence flags trembling while deputies understood the ground had remembered something Christmas had tried to hide beneath winter stars, before sunrise, alone there. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. That morning in December 2004 marked the formal beginning of the disappearance investigation of 22-year-old Elena Marquez, whose name would linger on laminated flyers pinned to grocery corkboards across Yuma County through Christmas Eve, New Year, and into a muted Thanksgiving remembered years later. She was 23, recently graduated from Northern Arizona University, back in her hometown for seasonal work, saving money and caring for her widowed father, the sort of routine life that rarely draws police attention until it collapses quietly. Elena was last seen on the evening of December 19th, leaving a small retail plaza near 4th Avenue as holiday lights flickered on, and the desert cooled fast, her silver sedan heading north toward a modest apartment she never reached. When she failed to arrive for her shift the next morning, coworkers assumed holiday traffic or family errands, a common December excuse that delayed the first call to police by critical hours. By the time officers filed the missing person report, the calendar had turned toward Christmas week, staffing was thin, and early assumptions leaned toward a voluntary absence, an error later documented in internal reviews. The discovery in the wash 3 days later changed the classification immediately, not because of spectacle but because of detail, items cataloged, positions mapped, the quiet certainty that the scene was not accidental. Elena's purse was recovered downwind from where deputies stood, intact, phone inside, keys absent, and her sedan was located the same afternoon parked neatly at a park and ride lot near Interstate 8, dusted with pollen and desert grit. The vehicle showed no sign of forced entry, no obvious struggle, and no mechanical failure, a fact that narrowed the timeline to a short window after she left the plaza, before the cold night erased casual witnesses. Detectives canvassed nearby roads, gas stations, and bus depots, collecting receipts and grainy surveillance stills, while search teams moved methodically through arroyos where winter shadows stretched early. The medical examiner's preliminary findings were careful and limited, consistent with environmental exposure following a short period of survival, with no immediate indicators contradicting an unlawful cause, language that left room for evidence yet to be found. Press coverage was restrained at first, reflecting the town's preference for facts over spectacle, but as Christmas approached and Elena's face appeared beside wreaths and sale ads, attention intensified. Detectives reconstructed Elena's final hours using transaction records, a coffee purchase, a fuel stop earlier in the day, and a brief call to her father promising to be home before dark. The call placed her alive at 6:41 p.m., after which her phone went silent, a battery later found fully charged, suggesting interruption rather than neglect. Investigators interviewed a man who had been seen lingering near the plaza, but his alibi held, verified by time-stamped security footage from a bowling alley across town. A second lead focused on a coworker with a recent argument, yet phone records and payroll logs placed him working overnight in Phoenix, a routine shift that eliminated suspicion. By New Year's Day, detectives faced a thinning trail, the desert offering few confessions, and the case was assigned a dedicated file room shelf that grew heavier with each unanswered memo. Despite the lull, evidence was preserved properly, clothing fibers bagged, soil samples logged, and the sedan stored under cover, a procedural discipline that would matter years later. Thanksgiving of 2005 passed with no arrest, then another Christmas, The Marquez home quieter each season, while detectives rotated assignments and the file aged in manila folders. In 2009, a cold case review was authorized, prompted by advances in forensic databases and a renewed push from Elena's father, who attended every public meeting without speaking. The review re-examined the sedan, revealing a partial palm print on the trunk lid previously deemed unusable, now suitable for comparison after improved imaging. Analysts also revisited cellular data, identifying a transient tower ping near the park and ride that aligned with a vehicle registered to a man with a history of opportunistic theft. The man, Daniel Rourke, had lived in Yuma in 2004, worked seasonal construction, and left the state weeks after Elena vanished, a move once dismissed as ordinary. Records showed a prior arrest for unlawful imprisonment that did not result in conviction, details buried in older systems not initially cross-referenced. Detectives obtained a warrant to collect a reference print after Rourke resurfaced in Nevada, now older, quieter, and employed as a maintenance worker at a casino. The comparison returned a match within accepted statistical thresholds, linking Rourke to the sedan, a lawful connection that reframed the timeline without overstating conclusions. Investigators traveled to Nevada during a December rain, interviewing Rourke under recorded conditions, documenting inconsistencies regarding his whereabouts on December 19, 2004. Search warrants followed, yielding clothing retained from that period, and a receipt placing him near the park and ride, small facts that accumulated weight. Confronted with the evidence, Rourke denied involvement, but further laboratory work identified Elena's fibers embedded in a jacket seam, consistent with transfer. Prosecutors reviewed the case cautiously, ensuring corroboration, mindful of elapsed time, and a grand jury returned an indictment late in November 2013. The arrest was executed quietly, without spectacle, reported in local papers beneath holiday headlines, a shock absorbed slowly by a community accustomed to resolution arriving sooner. Rourke was extradited to Arizona as Christmas decorations came down, arraigned on charges consistent with the evidence, and held without commentary. Elena's father attended the hearing, carrying a folded program from a church service, a private marker of time passing alongside public procedure. The trial preparation unfolded methodically, with motions addressing evidence integrity, chain of custody, and the admissibility of late-discovered forensic material. Winter returned to Yuma with clear nights and cold mornings as jurors were selected, instructed to weigh facts without emotion, and the case moved forward. Opening filings outlined a restrained narrative, emphasizing opportunity, transfer evidence, and the defendant's movements, avoiding speculation beyond the record. Defense arguments challenged memory decay and questioned the reliability of revisited samples, points addressed through expert testimony grounded in standards. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated through the approach of Thanksgiving, returning a verdict supported by the evidence presented. Rourke was convicted and later sentenced to a term consistent with state guidelines, a conclusion reached without theatrics. Elena Marquez's case closed on paper, yet the aftermath remained quiet, marked by a plaque at the park and ride, and a scholarship fund established in her name. Police procedures were updated following internal review, emphasizing early assumptions and the value of preserving evidence through seasonal delays. For the community, the resolution arrived as winter light returned, a reminder that patience and method can outlast time. Elena's father returned home after the final hearing, placing the folded program in a drawer, the seasons finally aligned with an answer. Records show the file archived in climate-controlled storage, a cold case no longer cold, its lessons circulated quietly among investigators. Each December since, the local paper runs a brief note, not sensational, acknowledging the work done and the life remembered. The desert wash remains unchanged, a place of wind and gravel, holding no secrets now, only the memory of how they were found. This investigation, begun in frost and concluded in paperwork, reflects the slow justice that defines many solved cold cases. It is a reminder that holidays pass, evidence waits, and diligence, applied steadily, can still speak. For those who worked the file, closure meant restraint, accuracy, and respect for process, values often invisible to the public. The verdict did not restore time lost, but it established responsibility within the law, which is the only promise the system makes. Elena Marquez is remembered here as a name and a case, and as a young woman whose absence was finally explained. That explanation, grounded in evidence and review, closed a chapter opened on a cold December morning. The remaining pages of the file note compliance, appeals exhausted, and finality, administrative language carrying human weight. In Yuma, winter gives way quickly, but some seasons linger until answered. This case stands as one of them, solved, documented, and set to rest. The community moved on, informed but unsensationalized, the way it prefers its news. Time, records show, did not defeat the investigation, it clarified it. That clarity arrived without noise, fitting the life it was meant to honor. In the end, the file closed. Justice followed procedure, and the season finally turned. This account preserves that record. It remains. End of message 1. Continuing next with further context and detail. After the verdict, attention returned to the years before the arrest, and investigators documented how the case survived long enough to be resolved. In early 2005, as Christmas decorations were boxed away and the desert resumed its familiar routines, detectives revisited Elena Marquez's apartment. The space had been sealed, then reopened with her father present, cataloging items left behind. Holiday cards sat unopened on a small table. A calendar on the wall stopped at December 19th, with a penciled note reminding her to buy wrapping paper. These details were recorded not for sentiment, but to confirm normal routine, reinforcing the conclusion that she had no plans to disappear. Financial records showed no unusual withdrawals beyond ordinary holiday spending. Her passport was located in a drawer, unused. These findings strengthened the classification of a non-voluntary disappearance, shaping the investigative posture going forward. Throughout 2005 and 2006, the case moved through predictable phases familiar to law enforcement veterans. Initial canvases gave way to re-canvases. Witnesses who had been vague were re-interviewed, statements compared for drift. A clerk at a convenience store near the Park and Ride recalled a silver sedan idling briefly near the air pump, though she could not identify the driver. Her recollection was logged with appropriate caveats, never elevated beyond its evidentiary weight. A highway maintenance worker reported seeing a man walking briskly near the same lot that night, wearing a dark jacket, hands shoved into pockets against the cold. No identification followed. The desert offers distance, and distance erodes clarity. Autopsy findings were finalized by February 2005. The report avoided conjecture, noting the absence of catastrophic injury and acknowledging that environmental factors complicated time of death estimation. Trace evidence was limited but preserved. Fingernail scrapings yielded no immediate profile with the technology available at the time. Toxicology was negative. The manner of death was listed as homicide based on circumstances rather than overt trauma, a classification sometimes misunderstood by the public, but standard in cases involving unexplained fatality following apparent abduction. This designation kept the case active, eligible for resources, and reviewed annually. Media coverage shifted with the seasons. During Thanksgiving 2005, the local paper ran a retrospective piece, summarizing known facts and asking for tips. The tone was restrained, emphasizing that investigators still sought information without speculating about suspects. Tips arrived sporadically, many well-intentioned but unproductive. Each was logged, assigned a number, and either closed or merged with existing leads. This administrative discipline, often overlooked, prevented duplication and preserved institutional memory as personnel changed. By 2007, Elena's case had entered the category informally referred to as dormant but open. Detectives assigned to new cases still carried the file, revisiting it during slower winter months. Advances in forensic science were monitored. The sedan was inspected again, this time with alternate light sources that revealed nothing new. Still, the vehicle remained stored, protected from contamination, an example of policy shaped by past lessons. Evidence rooms can be unforgiving to negligence, and supervisors ensured compliance through audits. The first significant shift came in 2009 with the formation of a regional cold case unit. Funding, modest but focused, allowed analysts to re-digitize older files. Elena's case benefited from this modernization. Handwritten notes were scanned, timelines entered into searchable databases, and names cross-referenced with newer criminal records. It was during this process that Daniel Rourke's name resurfaced, not as a suspect initially, but as a peripheral individual mentioned in an early report as a construction worker who frequented the park and ride. His file had been thin, lacking corroboration, and he had left Arizona shortly after the disappearance. At the time, that departure was unremarkable. Years later, viewed through aggregated data, it gained significance. Analysts examined Rourke's movements using employment records obtained through lawful requests. He had worked intermittently, paid in part by check, leaving a paper trail that intersected with Elena's timeline. A paycheck dated December 23, 2004, was issued from a company office near the park and ride. The distance was not incriminating on its own, but it narrowed opportunity. Further review revealed a prior arrest in California for unlawful restraint, dismissed after a plea to a lesser offense. Such information, while not evidence of guilt, informed risk assessment and justified further inquiry. Detectives proceeded cautiously. Cold casework demands patience and restraint, particularly when years have passed. A decision was made to pursue forensic reanalysis before any interview. The partial palm print recovered from the sedan was sent to a state lab equipped with updated imaging software. The result, returned months later, indicated sufficient points for comparison. When matched against Rourke's print obtained from a past arrest, the correspondence exceeded threshold standards. This was the first concrete link, documented meticulously, peer-reviewed, and approved by supervisors before inclusion in the case file. The cellular data review followed. In 2004, location accuracy was limited, but analysts reconstructed approximate movements by mapping tower connections. Rourke's phone records placed him in Yuma that evening, with a brief connection near the park, and rides shortly after Elena's last confirmed call. Again, not definitive alone, but consistent with the emerging picture. Investigators prepared an interview plan, mindful of legal constraints and the need to avoid contamination of testimony. The interview took place in Nevada in December 2012, timed deliberately during a period when Rourke's employment schedule allowed availability. 2 detectives traveled quietly, coordinating with local authorities. The interview was conducted in a standard room, recorded, with Rourke informed of his rights. He spoke calmly, describing his life in 2004 in general terms, minimizing specifics. When asked about Yuma, he acknowledged living there briefly but claimed limited recall. Inconsistencies emerged regarding his transportation and employment dates. These discrepancies were noted, not confronted aggressively, preserving the integrity of the interaction. Following the interview, investigators sought additional corroboration. A search warrant executed at Rourke's residence yielded clothing retained from earlier years, including a dark jacket. Forensic examination identified fibers consistent with those collected from Elena's clothing. The analysis included controls and peer review, adhering to accepted protocols. Combined with the palm print and cellular data, the evidentiary mosaic approached prosecutorial sufficiency. The decision to seek indictment was not taken lightly. Prosecutors evaluated the case over several months, anticipating defense challenges related to time lapse and evidence handling. Chain of custody documentation was scrutinized. Expert witnesses were vetted. Only after consensus was reached did the case move forward. The grand jury proceedings in November 2013 were brief and factual. An indictment was returned without fanfare. Rourke's arrest, executed shortly thereafter, was reported locally with restraint. Headlines noted the development without sensational language. For many residents, the news arrived unexpectedly, a reminder of a case assumed unresolved. Law enforcement leadership emphasized process over triumph, underscoring that arrests mark a phase, not an endpoint. As the legal process unfolded, Elena Marquez's name returned to public discourse, framed by facts rather than speculation. Her father declined interviews, issuing a brief statement thanking investigators. The community responded quietly. There were no rallies, no demonstrations, only attendance at court proceedings by those directly connected. Pretrial motions addressed expected issues. Defense counsel challenged the admissibility of the palm print, arguing technological evolution. The court ruled after hearing expert testimony, finding the methods reliable and the chain intact. Similar rulings addressed fiber evidence and cellular analysis. Each decision was recorded, contributing to appellate resilience. By the time the trial date was set, nearly a decade had passed since that December morning in the wash. Jurors selected were reminded of the responsibility inherent in weighing delayed justice. The case presented was methodical, relying on accumulation rather than a single dramatic piece. It reflected the reality of many solved cold cases, where persistence substitutes for immediacy. As proceedings moved toward conclusion, the seasonal cycle repeated. Thanksgiving approached, then winter. The timing was not lost on those involved, but it did not alter the process. When the jury returned its verdict, it did so based on evidence presented, insulated from narrative flourish. The conviction affirmed the investigative path chosen years earlier. This portion of the story illustrates how cases survive dormancy. Evidence preserved, records maintained, and periodic review allowed Elena Marquez's case to move from uncertainty to resolution. It underscores that cold cases are not static archives but living files, awaiting alignment of technology, attention, and circumstance. In Yuma, the resolution reinforced faith in procedural persistence. The desert remained unchanged, but the record was corrected. The investigation continued into sentencing and aftermath, which follows. The sentencing phase extended the methodical tone that had defined the investigation, reinforcing that resolution in a cold case is administrative as much as emotional. In early January following the conviction, pre-sentence reports were compiled, drawing from decades of records, employment histories, and psychological assessments. The court reviewed these materials alongside victim impact documentation submitted by Elena Marquez's family. The language remained controlled, factual, and consistent with statutory guidance, avoiding theatrical expression. When sentencing occurred, the judge cited the cumulative weight of evidence and the sustained harm caused by prolonged uncertainty. The term imposed aligned with Arizona guidelines in effect at the time of the offense, accounting for aggravating factors and the absence of mitigating circumstances compelling deviation. The defendant was remanded to state custody without incident, and the case transitioned from active prosecution to post-conviction administration. In the weeks that followed, law enforcement agencies conducted internal after-action reviews, a standard practice for cases spanning multiple years. These reviews focused on decision points rather than outcomes. The initial classification delay was examined, with acknowledgement that early assumptions, common during holiday staffing shortages, can influence momentum. Recommendations were issued emphasizing early preservation regardless of perceived risk, particularly during December and January, when community routines change and reporting lags are more likely. Training modules were updated, using anonymized excerpts from Elena's case to illustrate procedural lessons. These updates were circulated quietly, integrated into ongoing professional development rather than announced publicly. The evidence archive was audited once more before final sealing. Items retained included the sedan documentation, forensic reports, and original interview recordings. Each was logged with final disposition notes, ensuring accessibility for appellate review if required. Appeals were filed and addressed in due course, focusing on evidentiary standards rather than factual innocence. Appellate courts upheld the conviction, citing adherence to established forensic methodology and proper jury instruction. With appeals exhausted, the case achieved legal finality. Community response remained subdued. Local media published a brief follow-up after sentencing, noting closure without revisiting graphic detail. Editorials emphasized the importance of patience and process, reflecting a readership accustomed to measured reporting. There were no documentaries commissioned locally, no public forums convened. The story settled into the archive of resolved cases, referenced occasionally in discussions about cold case success but rarely elaborated upon. For Elena Marquez's father, closure manifested privately. Court records indicate he attended the sentencing, seated quietly, leaving promptly afterward. He later submitted a letter to the department expressing appreciation for persistence without elaboration. Investigators familiar with the case understood this restraint as consistent with his demeanor throughout the years. The scholarship fund established in Elena's name continued to award modest grants to local students pursuing criminal justice studies, an understated legacy aligned with the procedural values that ultimately resolved her case. From an investigative standpoint, the case underscored the evolving role of technology. The palm print, once insufficient, became pivotal through improved imaging. Cellular data, rudimentary by modern standards, gained relevance through contextual mapping. These elements did not replace traditional police work but complemented it, validating the preservation choices made early on. Supervisors noted that without proper storage and documentation, later advances would have been irrelevant. This observation reinforced policy emphasis on evidence stewardship, particularly in cases lacking immediate leads. The desert environment itself featured prominently in internal analysis. Yuma County's geography complicates searches, with vast open areas that can conceal evidence quickly yet preserve it under certain conditions. Seasonal temperature swings affect decomposition and trace survival in ways that challenge time of death estimates. Training materials incorporated these environmental considerations, advising investigators to consult regional forensic specialists early. Elena's autopsy findings, cautious and limited, were later viewed as appropriately restrained, avoiding conclusions unsupported by data. The park and ride lot where the sedan was found underwent minor changes over the years, resurfaced, and expanded to accommodate increased traffic. A small plaque installed near the perimeter acknowledged Elena's memory without detailing circumstances. It became part of the landscape, noticed primarily by those who knew its significance. Maintenance records show it was cleaned regularly, never vandalized, an indicator of quiet respect rather than public fixation. Within the department, personnel changes gradually distanced current staff from the case's origins. Younger detectives learned of it through briefings rather than first-hand experience. Yet the file remained a reference point, cited during winter months when caseloads shifted and training schedules allowed reflection. Veterans used it to illustrate that persistence does not require constant activity, only consistent readiness to act when new information emerges. Thanksgiving seasons following the resolution passed without renewed attention. The holidays regained their ordinary rhythms, unshadowed by ongoing uncertainty. For the community, this normalization represented a form of healing, understated but real. The absence of sensationalism contributed to this outcome, allowing residents to integrate the resolution into collective memory without reopening wounds. From a legal perspective, the case demonstrated the viability of prosecuting decades-old crimes when standards are met. Prosecutors documented the approach in internal memoranda, emphasizing careful sequencing of evidence presentation and transparent acknowledgement of limitations. These documents circulated within the office, informing future decisions on cold case filings. The lesson was clear: restraint enhances credibility. The defendant's incarceration followed standard classification procedures. Correctional records note compliance with intake protocols and assignment to a facility appropriate for the sentence length. No special conditions were imposed beyond those mandated. The system absorbed the outcome as it does all others, efficiently and without comment. Elena Marquez's name appears now in state databases under resolved cases, her status updated accordingly. This administrative change, though mundane, marked the formal end of investigative responsibility. It allowed resources to shift to other unresolved files, continuing the cycle. Detectives involved expressed satisfaction privately, not as triumph, but as completion of duty. The broader significance of the case lies in its ordinariness. There were no confessions, no dramatic reversals, no hidden conspiracies. The resolution emerged from alignment of preserved evidence, technological progress, and procedural patience. For audiences familiar with decades of true crime narratives, this realism resonates, particularly among those who value process over spectacle. As winter returns each year to Yuma, mornings still bring frost to desert plants, and the air carries the same metallic clarity described in early reports. The environment that once concealed answers now holds none. Records remain, sealed and indexed, accessible for study but no longer demanding action. The case rests in its final state, solved within the law. This continuation prepares the final examination of the trial itself, the jury's deliberation context, and the quiet aftermath that followed. The remaining account will complete the chronology, ensuring the full arc from discovery to resolution is preserved accurately and without embellishment. The trial phase, though legally decisive, unfolded with the same measured pace that characterized the investigation. Jury selection began in late autumn, timed deliberately to avoid peak holiday disruptions. Prospective jurors were screened for familiarity with the case, which, despite its age, remained recognizable to many older residents who remembered the missing person flyers from Christmas seasons past. Those selected reflected a cross-section of the county, men and women accustomed to routine civic duty rather than high-profile proceedings. Instructions emphasized neutrality, the burden of proof, and the importance of evaluating evidence presented without regard to elapsed time. The prosecution's case was constructed chronologically, beginning with Elena Marquez's routine life in December 2004. Records were introduced to establish her stability, employment, and future plans, not as character testimony, but to negate theories of voluntary disappearance. Bank statements, academic transcripts, and employment schedules were presented clinically. Investigators testified regarding the timeline of her last confirmed movements, supported by receipts and call logs. Each exhibit was authenticated methodically, reflecting awareness that cold case trials invite heightened scrutiny. Forensic testimony followed. Analysts explained the palm print comparison in accessible terms, detailing how earlier limitations had rendered the print unusable and how subsequent advances allowed reliable analysis. Defense counsel cross-examined on error rates and methodology, points addressed through reference to peer-reviewed standards and laboratory accreditation. The court allowed the evidence, noting its compliance with accepted practices. Fiber analysis was presented next, contextualized carefully to avoid overstating certainty. Experts clarified that fiber transfer indicates contact consistent with the timeline, not exclusivity. This restraint enhanced credibility rather than diminishing impact. Cellular data analysis occupied significant courtroom time. Given the age of the records, analysts emphasized limitations, explaining tower ranges and probabilities. Visual aids illustrated approximate movement without precision claims. The prosecution framed this evidence as corroborative, not standalone proof. Jurors were instructed accordingly. Employment and payroll records placed Daniel Rourke in proximity to relevant locations during the critical window. Witnesses testified regarding record-keeping practices, establishing reliability. The defense strategy focused on reasonable doubt arising from time lapse. Counsel argued memory degradation, potential contamination, and alternative explanations. They highlighted the absence of eyewitness identification and direct physical evidence linking the defendant to the wash where Elena was found. These arguments were expected and addressed through rebuttal testimony emphasizing cumulative weight rather than singular proof. The court sustained objections when either side approached speculation, maintaining procedural discipline. Throughout the trial, Elena Marquez's presence was represented through records rather than narrative flourish. Photographs were limited, chosen to identify rather than evoke emotion. The court's tone remained controlled. Observers noted the absence of overt reactions, a reflection of both judicial guidance and community temperament. Closing arguments summarized evidence without rhetorical excess. The prosecution reiterated the alignment of opportunity, forensic linkage, and inconsistent statements. The defense reminded jurors of the presumption of innocence and the dangers of retrospective certainty. Jury instructions followed, detailed and precise, outlining standards for evaluating circumstantial evidence. Deliberations began as temperatures dropped and holiday lights appeared along courthouse streets. Jurors reviewed exhibits, requested clarification on forensic testimony, and revisited timelines. The process extended over several days, interrupted only by routine scheduling considerations. When the verdict was returned, it reflected careful deliberation rather than haste. The finding of guilt rested on the totality of evidence, as articulated in post-verdict polling. Sentencing, as documented earlier, concluded the formal legal process, yet the aftermath extended beyond courtrooms. Law enforcement agencies updated public databases, closing open entries and notifying relevant departments. The missing person designation was removed, replaced by resolved status. This administrative act carried symbolic weight, marking an end to uncertainty. In the months following, investigators archived personal notes accumulated over years. These notes, often handwritten during late winter reviews, were either digitized or destroyed according to policy. The transition from active file to archive signaled professional closure. Detectives reassigned to other cases carried forward lessons learned, particularly regarding holiday period reporting delays and the importance of early evidence preservation. Community institutions responded quietly. Churches that had once included Elena's name in prayer lists removed it respectfully. Local charities adjusted annual events that had referenced her disappearance. The scholarship fund continued, its criteria refined to emphasize forensic science and criminal justice ethics, reflecting the procedural nature of the case's resolution. From a historical perspective, the case became part of Arizona's broader cold case narrative. Training conferences referenced it as an example of delayed but lawful resolution. Presentations avoided dramatization, focusing instead on documentation, interagency cooperation, and technological integration. The emphasis aligned with an audience that values process over spectacle, particularly older professionals familiar with incremental progress. The defendant's post-conviction life entered routine correctional management. Records indicate no extraordinary incidents, appeals limited to procedural review. The system absorbed the case, as it does all others, reducing it to numbers and schedules. This normalization, while stark, reflects the finality sought by the justice process. Elena Marquez's memory persisted in quieter forms. Her name appears annually in a small column listing resolved cases that shaped policy updates. Former investigators occasionally visited the park and ride, not ceremonially but as part of patrol routes, aware of its history without dwelling on it. The plaque remained, weathered but intact, a subtle marker amid asphalt and desert plants. As years passed, newer cases occupied public attention. The 2004 disappearance receded into context, remembered primarily by those who lived through its uncertainty. For them, the resolution reaffirmed confidence in methodical work. It demonstrated that time complicates but does not preclude justice when procedures are followed and evidence respected. This stage of the account prepares the final reflection on the quiet aftermath, the legal closure's long-term implications, and the enduring principles illustrated by the case. The remaining narrative will complete the record, ensuring the full cycle from discovery through deliberation to resolution is documented accurately and without embellishment. The final stage of the Arizona 2004 cold case unfolded not with headlines, but with documentation, routine correspondence, and the gradual settling of a matter that had occupied space in public memory for nearly a decade. After sentencing and the exhaustion of appeals, the clerk's office issued formal notices closing the file. These notices traveled through channels most people never see, updating statewide systems, federal indices, and internal registries that track unresolved cases. Elena Marquez's status changed definitively from missing and deceased to resolved homicide, a bureaucratic action that carried weight precisely because it was understated. For investigators, the conclusion prompted reflection rather than celebration. Retirement ceremonies and end-of-year briefings referenced the case briefly, noting it as an example of delayed resolution achieved without compromise. Senior detectives emphasized to younger staff that the outcome was not the product of brilliance or intuition, but of restraint, patience, and adherence to procedure across years when progress seemed impossible. The case became part of institutional memory, invoked when budgets were discussed or when evidence retention policies faced scrutiny. Elena's father made no public statements following the final ruling. Records show he declined offers of interviews and requested privacy. He continued to live in the same modest home, according to property filings, maintaining routines that had not changed since before December 2004. The scholarship fund in Elena's name released annual summaries listing recipients and amounts, each modest, each accompanied by a brief statement emphasizing diligence and integrity. There were no ceremonies, only letters mailed quietly. In Yuma, the seasons continued their predictable rotation. Thanksgiving brought cooler nights and familiar traffic patterns. Christmas returned with lights strung along storefronts and courthouse steps. For many residents, the holidays no longer carried the unresolved tension once associated with Elena's disappearance. The case's resolution allowed memory to soften into history, a shift noticeable only in hindsight. Missing person flyers no longer appeared on bulletin boards. Conversations that once ended with uncertainty now ended with a name, a sentence, and a conclusion. Law enforcement agencies conducted one final procedural review 2 years after closure, a standard audit to ensure compliance with archival standards. The review confirmed that evidence had been sealed correctly, that digital backups existed in multiple secure locations, and that access logs were complete. The file was transferred to long-term storage, climate-controlled and indexed, available for academic study or legal reference but no longer active. The desert wash where initial evidence was documented remained unmarked beyond the small plaque, its significance known primarily through records rather than rumor. From a broader perspective, the case influenced regional cooperation. Memoranda of understanding between Arizona and neighboring states were updated to streamline information sharing regarding transient workers, a category that had complicated early analysis. Training sessions emphasized the importance of re-evaluating peripheral individuals when new tools become available. These changes did not bear Elena's name publicly, but their origin was traceable within internal documentation. The legal community noted the case as confirmation that circumstantial evidence, when layered carefully, can meet standards even after long delays. Law journals summarized the appellate decisions, focusing on evidentiary admissibility and jury instruction rather than narrative detail. These summaries circulated quietly among practitioners, contributing to evolving best practices. The case did not alter law, but it reinforced existing principles. For the jury members who served, the experience remained personal but private. Post-trial surveys indicated a shared sense of responsibility rather than emotional resolution. Several jurors noted the challenge of evaluating aged evidence, acknowledging the discipline required to separate sympathy from proof. Their feedback informed future juror orientation materials, emphasizing clarity and patience in complex cases. Daniel Rourke's incarceration proceeded without incident. Correctional records list routine transfers and program participation consistent with policy. There were no extraordinary petitions, no claims that altered the legal outcome. The system processed the conviction as it does thousands of others, efficiently and without commentary. This ordinariness underscored the finality of the process. Elena Marquez's case entered public record as a solved cold case, cited occasionally in documentaries and reports that favored accuracy over dramatization. When referenced, it was described in measured terms, highlighting procedural persistence rather than mystery. This framing aligned with the community's preference for realism, particularly among older audiences familiar with the slow pace of institutional work. In the years following closure, the park and ride lot continued to serve commuters. Maintenance logs show routine resurfacing and repainting. The plaque remained intact, its text simple, offering no details beyond a name and dates. It did not invite attention, but it endured, a quiet acknowledgement integrated into daily life. The case's legacy rests largely in what it did not become. There were no speculative theories, no competing narratives, no sensational retellings that distorted facts. The investigation resisted those paths, adhering instead to documentation and verification. This restraint preserved credibility and ensured that resolution, when it arrived, was accepted without controversy. As time passed, newer cases demanded attention, each with its own uncertainties and potential for delay. Elena's file, now closed, served as reassurance that persistence can eventually align with opportunity. It reminded investigators that even when seasons pass and evidence grows cold, the record remains, waiting for clarity. The final administrative act occurred quietly when the Cold Case Unit updated its annual report, listing Elena Marquez among cases resolved through forensic reanalysis. The entry was brief, factual, and unadorned. It marked the end of official attention. Beyond that, the story belonged to memory and record. In December, when frost again touches the desert and holiday lights appear, the environment mirrors that first morning of discovery, though without uncertainty. The ground that once held unanswered questions holds none now. The file is closed, the responsibility assigned, the process complete. This case, solved within the law, demonstrates the endurance of method over time. It affirms that justice, when pursued without haste or spectacle, can arrive even after years of silence. Elena Marquez's name remains in the record, not as an unresolved absence, but as a resolved truth, established through evidence, patience, and restraint.